So have you ever felt like you're stuck on a painting and the painting's taken forever and you just can't quite finish it? Or perhaps you're traveling somewhere and there's loads of beautiful scenery to paint, but you don't feel like you quite have the time to actually set up and paint the landscape or whatever it is that you want to paint. So you end up going, "Oh, I probably won't paint." Well, today I'm going to share my tips on how to paint faster, and that's going to give you confidence to paint more often and the ability to actually make more paintings in a year. And it's also going to help you if you've got a lot of commissions. You'll be able to do those quicker, so you won't keep your clients waiting for too long, and it will give you more time to work on the paintings that you really like to work on. So there's nothing wrong with painting slowly. Some artists would spend weeks, months, years on a painting, and it's your own creative process. So like I say, there's nothing wrong with that, but there are certainly times where painting quickly can be a real advantage. And a lot of my friends from art school and even clients who I do paintings for often say, "George, you paint really fast." Now, I'd rather they say I paint really well, but I'll take it. Painting fast can be helpful. So I'm going to give you 5 simple points, techniques, things you can do with your approach, which will speed up your painting process without losing any quality in your work. It may even help you improve the quality of your work. So let's start with my first point, which is the very start of the painting, to apply an Imprimatur, which is basically Italian for like an underlayer. So apply a wash of a colour to your canvas before you start painting. So instead of painting directly onto a white canvas, little specks of white of the canvas are going to break through your brush strokes, and areas you haven't covered are going to be very distracting because the white is going to really stand out and it's going to throw off the harmony of the painting and throw off your values as well. So often I'd say apply a quick wash to your canvas. Normally you have a mid-tone or a light mid-tone, so that way if you don't cover every area of your painting with paint, it's not going to be distracting, and that mid-tone can actually add a nice harmony to your painting. So there's different ways of doing this. You could apply a neutral grey mid-tone. That way you can judge all your colour mixes very accurately the moment you put them onto your painting. Or you could choose, say, perhaps a warm underlayer, and if that breaks through in certain areas, it could add a bit of vibrancy. Often if you're painting on like a summer's day and you've got a lot of greens, having a sort of red-brown mid-tone, if that breaks through in a few areas, it'll add some more vibrancy to the greens. Or you could pick a colour, and I've got an example of this here. You could pick a colour which is abundant in your painting, apply that as the underlayer, and then you could leave that so in the end result there's certain areas of the painting that you don't have to paint and the underlayer will work for you. For example, this painting I did of a model called Elizabeth, I painted this in about 3 hours from life in one sitting, and she was wearing this green top. So what I did is I applied the underlayer of this sort of dull green to the whole canvas, painted her portrait, and then when it came to painting her top, I could just paint the background around it and just hint to the outline of her shoulders, put a few accents for the shadows in there, and then instantly that looks like her green top without me having to spend any time on actually painting it. So this is quite a good way of saving time when you paint and add in a harmony and a unity to your painting. And the underlayer can be applied very quickly in less than a minute. Just put a bit of paint on your painting, rub it in with some solvent and a tissue, and you're good to go. Another way you can use the Imprimatur to speed up your process, if you apply the Imprimatur and then start painting on top of it whilst it's still wet, you can actually use a technique known as wiping out. So you get a rag or a tissue and you wipe away the big light shapes in your composition. That way you get a very quick value impression of the overall scene, and will also help you when you're drawing the proportions, as you'll be able to see those big shapes clearer, as it's easier for us to see shapes of tonal value than it is just to look at lines and try and get them all in the right place. As your painting gets closer to what you're looking at in nature, any mistakes will jump out to you and be more apparent, so they'll be easier to fix. Also, by wiping away at the canvas, it gives you a bit more control over the surface than going straight in with thick paint, which if you try and correct that by painting on top of it, paint can mix on the surface and it can be a little bit more fiddly, or you may have to scrape it off. So often I like to start wiping away the light shapes, and this is a good way of starting the painting quickly. Which moves into point number 2, which is to focus on the big shapes and hold back on the details. So if you're in a rush to finish a painting, you may feel like, oh, I've got to paint those eyes, I've got to paint the nose. But if you hold back on them, squint, step back, focus on getting the big shapes first, like a sculptor working away at a marble, carve out the big shapes of the composition, and then as you go you can start adding those smaller details. The reason why I'd say hold back on the small details and the features and things is because if you go straight in and let's say you paint the eye and you paint that specular highlight and it's all nice and rendered, but you realise it's not quite in the right place, you're going to have to paint it again. You're going to have to scrape it out and move it to the left or up and down or wherever it needs to go. So by painting the big shapes and you're working your way in, that way you keep control over the proportions of your scene, whether you're painting a portrait or a landscape. So point number 3 is to use bigger brushes, or use the brushes that you use normally and just paint on a smaller scale. Because one thing which takes quite a bit of time is actually covering the surface of your canvas. For example, this painting here, it's over 2 meters tall. It took me a long time to just paint and cover the canvas. So if you paint smaller, it's going to be quicker, and if you use a bigger brush, again, you'll cover the surface faster. And that's quite self-explanatory. Often if I'm going to paint, say, the twilight, which only lasts for about half an hour, or a sunset from life, I'll maybe use a small canvas, relatively big brushes, as big a brush as I can for that area of the painting. Okay, point 4 now. And this one may sound a little bit counterintuitive, but it is actually to spend more time mixing the colours on your palette at the start. So the great painter John Singer Sargent, there's an account by one of his sitters who basically writes about the experience of John Singer Sargent painting her portrait. And she notes how it was strange how Sargent would spend so much time just mixing and playing with colours on his palette before he even put any paint down on the canvas. And the reason why this will actually save you time is there's a saying that the painting is done on the palette. So basically when you're mixing the paints in your palette, you can make all those mistakes with the tonal values, the colours, and you can adjust them there and keep mixing the colour until it's right for the painting. And another way this will save you time is try and mix big piles of paint. Don't just mix a little bit of paint, because otherwise you're going to have to stop halfway through your painting and then mix the colours again. So definitely mix big amounts of paint, and if you are working over a period of days, you can actually scrape the paint off your palette at the end of the day. If you're working with oil paint, put it into a Tupperware, put that in the fridge or fill it with water, or even just an airtight Tupperware container, and then you can use the same mix the next day. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to the final point, which is to actually not just use bigger brushes, but to use longer brushes. So there's a few advantages to using longer brushes, which will make your painting process faster. I visited an atelier in America, and there's a very eccentric sort of old painting master there, and he was saying that you should stand side on and paint arm's length like a fencer, on guard. And there is something to it, actually standing on and painting with your paintbrush, almost like a sword fight. And the reason for that is it's good to have distance from your work, and by standing back and using a long brush, you see your whole canvas in one, and you also can perhaps see your sitter or the landscape just by flicking your eyes to the side of your canvas. And it will force you to paint the big shapes rather than getting trapped in the details like we were talking about earlier, because the reality is when you're this far away from your canvas, you can't see those details. So you're just focusing on the most important things, which are the big shapes and the tonal values and the colours. And the details, then you can add them in later on. Another way that painting with a long brush is going to speed up your process is it's actually a lot quicker to apply the brush strokes with a long brush. Imagine if I was up close to this painting just fiddling it like that. That would take me forever. So I used a long brush and a big, long, broad brush, and I could apply broader strokes more dynamic brush marks, and it saved me time painting the painting. And actually quite a few artists throughout history have used really long brushes to paint. The great Spanish artist Sorolla, there's photos of him using brushes like this or a bit longer to paint some of his paintings. And even the great English portrait and landscape painter Thomas Gainsborough, there's accounts that he would actually tie a brush to the end of a broom, put his canvas next to his sitter, and then stand on the other side of the room and paint the portrait with that brush on the end of a broom. So you can imagine that would take quite a lot of dexterity, because a small wobble of my hand here is going to be quite a big brush stroke at the end of the broom. The occasions that I've tried this approach of painting with a big brush, I normally find I can get everything in a lot quicker. When I get up to the painting surface, everything looks a bit impressionistic, the brush strokes are quite broad and the details are not that refined, which is actually quite a nice look, but you can refine those later on if you want. One final point, I know I said I'd give you 5, this is sort of 6, is you don't have to paint everything. You can leave stuff out. The painting should really have sort of like a focal point. You don't have to paint every area of the scene. If you're painting a landscape, the tendency is every section you look at, you're going to look at it with your eyes, see it in sharp detail and paint it in. Whereas actually if you look at the scene overall, there's going to be one thing which is going to capture your attention. And when you're looking at that, everything else is going to be a bit more blurred, a bit softer. So you don't have to paint everything in sharp focus and sharp detail, because it's going to look a bit distracting and not actually that realistic. You can save that for a few areas of the focal point. Hopefully these tips will help you paint faster, will give you confidence to approach perhaps some fleeting light effects, and help you paint more paintings throughout the year. If this was useful, please give me a thumbs up, do subscribe to my YouTube channel, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.